belonging. Some people die before they fulfill their desires. Such a waste of existence. Waste of existence. We spend our life searching for the sense of belonging. Some people die before they fulfill their desires. Such a waste of existence. Waste of existence.
The sun is shining and the anxious earth is rising. Anxious earth is rising. I'm so happy.
We spend our life searching for this sense of belonging. Some people die before they fulfill their desires.
Okay, let's try this again. All right, did you hear any of that? Probably not. All right. It's cold. My name is Ron. I live in New Hampshire, and we're going to talk about civil rights and starting all the way going back to the Civil War and the 14th Amendment. That's a summary of what I just said when my mic was not working. All right, so let's go back here. Here we go. All right. And I'm going to check something here really quick. All right, I'm going to start this, but I'm going to go check something while it's going. And just to make sure that everything's working properly. So here we go.
Many parts of the United States Constitution deal with the rights of an individual, and many amendments talk about protecting or expanding the rights of an individual. But the 14th Amendment is perhaps one of the most important amendments in this discussion of protecting civil rights. And in particular, Section 1 is the part that is most cited. So let's just read this together. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So let's just focus in on parts of it. So one big takeaway about the 14th Amendment, this is the federal government saying, hey, these are things that the state cannot do. So for example, when it says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, this is a restatement of the Fifth Amendment that, hey, people can't just stick you in jail or take away your property without you going through some type of a process, a legal process. Well, in the Fifth Amendment, this was really talking about the federal government not being able to just take your property or your liberty away from you without the process of law. But here it's saying, nor shall any state. And this clause right over here, this is known as the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Then right after that, it says, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The equal protection of the laws. I'm going to underline that. And this, you might guess, is called the Equal Protection Clause. Now, the context in which the 14th Amendment was ratified, it happens in 1868, shortly after the end of the Civil War. You, of course, have the 13th Amendment that, among other things, abolishes slavery. But then you have these things in the South called black codes, which continued to repress the rights of African Americans. And that's why Congress felt the need for the 14th Amendment to be passed. Now, one of the most notable cases in which the 14th Amendment was brought up happens in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. And we have a whole video about this. And this is a case in which it was argued that it was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment for African Americans to have to travel in a separate train car from white Americans. And the Supreme Court infamously said that, hey, as long as it is equal, it is okay for it to be separate, and that would not violate the 14th Amendment. And so this idea of separate but equal comes about. Now, that was significantly challenged as we go into 1954, where you have Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Board of Education. And here, the argument was that inherently separate could not be equal. And once again, the 14th Amendment was invoked. And this time, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that yes, separate can't be equal, and that the schools needed to be desegregated. So even though it wasn't an official overruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, it was a functional overruling of this doctrine of separate but equal. And as we go into the 1960s civil rights movement, led by folks like Martin Luther King, there's the 14th Amendment that was cited often. In another video, we're going to look at Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he articulates the ideas of the civil rights movement. It's a quite moving letter. But once again, it's evoking these ideas of the 14th Amendment. And it goes on to movements as disparate as the women's rights movement, led by organizations like the National Organization for Women, citing equal protection of the laws in situations of sexual discrimination in the workplace. You have pro-life groups citing the 14th Amendment, arguing that an unborn fetus's right to life is protected by the 14th Amendment. You have rulings around whether quotas in higher education are legal or not, once again, citing ideas of equal protection of the laws. So as you go forth in your study of United States government, the 14th Amendment, especially Section 1, is going to keep showing up.
All right, I guess that was it on that, huh? So, yeah, one thing that, I don't, maybe he'll talk about this in another video. No, I don't think he did. The 14th Amendment is used for something called incorporation, so that all of the right, you know, it was kind of general, right, in that thing. Let me bring that up again here.
Many parts of the United States Constitution.
All right. These words are rather general, you know. Abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. And what's that? What's a privilege and immunities, right? That's up for grabs, you know. Nor shall any state provide personal life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process of law is that was continually, you know, up revised. You know, they're changing what they mean about that. Nor deny any person within jurisdiction the equal protection laws. So that in order to figure out what these things were, what they meant, they incorporated the rights from the Bill of Rights. You know, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution were incorporated over time. They would say, okay, well, the First Amendment, that's one, you know, that's something that is covered by this. And then, you know, so they did it by piecemeal. They said, okay, Fifth Amendment, parts of the Fifth Amendment. The property, obviously, that was the part of the Fifth Amendment too. And so they just over time, one by one, by piecemeal, they incorporated this process of incorporation. They made the Bill of Rights apply to the states also. See, that's what this whole thing is about, right? We fought the Civil War about slavery, and the states were saying, "Oh no, we're a state in this federal system here, so we can decide ourselves what we want to do, you know, including slavery," which was just absurd, you know, that they used that argument. And so this 14th Amendment was, you know, there were three amendments, right? There was 14th, 15th, 13th, 14th, and 15th. 13th got rid of slavery. This is the 14th Amendment that got rid of that, what the states were trying to say, that they had power to do these things. And then the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to black people, black men at that time. So over time they had to incorporate the Bill of Rights and say, okay, yeah, the First Amendment, that's one of these things that are covered by the 14th Amendment. One of the you know, the liberty and laws that should be applied to the states too. And then there was a discussion at the very beginning. He said, oh, should all this, we should just take all of the Bill of Rights and say that all applies to the states, just do it all at one time. And of course, you know, being lawyers, they said, then we won't have, you know, we won't have power, we won't be able to make these decisions on, you know, get bribes or whatever for all this time. So they did it piecemeal. And one of the first decisions they had about this was the slaughterhouse decisions. I forget when that was. Yeah, it was one of the early ones. And they were going to say, okay, let's use the equal protection clause, and that's what we'll use to incorporate the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment, so it applies to the states. And the slaughterhouse cases, they got rid of that. They said, no, we're going to use the due process clause, which is kind of bizarre. Anyway, so that's the 14th Amendment, and it makes this section makes all the parts of that apply to the federal government, like the Bill of Rights and stuff like that, apply to the states also. So the states can't overrule that and do slavery or do goofy things, really, say that people don't have the right to property or whatever. The states have to follow all the rules of the Bill of Rights. So, all right, now let's see if he's got another one out here. Let me do this so I don't. All right. Let's see. I don't know what this is. This is it says powers that the Constitution grants the government to protect civil rights. I know it's kind of let's just work our way chronologically here. So he's got another one here on Jim Crow. Let's see here. Let me make sure this is Creative Commons. Okay, let me see what covers here. I think all of those are Creative Commons. I think we're covered. And it's sure like all my videos I release Creative Commons also, so I think we're covered there. So, all right, so this is Jim Crow Part 1.
In this video, I want to talk about the system of Jim Crow segregation, which was common in the United States from about 1877 to approximately 1954, although it goes a little bit farther than that. Now, you're probably familiar with some of the aspects of Jim Crow segregation from the Civil Rights Movement. Jim Crow segregation involved the loss of voting rights for African Americans, as well as separate public accommodations. And by public accommodations, I mean all sorts of public spaces in American life. So this might be transportation, separate areas and trains and buses, or hotels, bathrooms, swimming pools, water fountains. So these places in public life where African Americans were put in the place of a second-class citizenship, where they could not experience the full range of movement, job benefits, protection of the law, or really any of the aspects of American citizenship that are the benefits that come with paying taxes and abiding by the law. And during this period of Jim Crow, this kind of segregation was legal. This was not just in practice, but encoded in the law. So where did this system of Jim Crow come from? Well, let's start with the name Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow was not the name of a specific person. Actually, Jim Crow was the name of a stock character. A stock character is kind of a basic, well-known character in usually a comedy. And we still have stock characters in comedy today in lots of different forms of entertainment. Think of the absent-minded professor, or more recently, the manic pixie dream girl. The girl who's going to change her whole life by being so off the wall. Well, Jim Crow was one of these characters in a form of entertainment called the minstrel show. And the minstrel show was a very popular kind of vaudeville type live performance. And the minstrel show was actually very popular in the north of the United States, places like New York City, in the 1830s, 1840s, kind of this antebellum period before the Civil War. So this character of Jim Crow was supposed to be kind of the stupid slave who lived on the plantation. And this character of Jim Crow was almost always played by a white man wearing black makeup on his face. So it was not an actual African-American person, but rather a caricature of an African-American person by a white man who was part of a minstrel troupe. And so the name Jim Crow became kind of synonymous with African Americans and with enslaved people in the early 19th century, the way that, say, Paddy became synonymous with an Irish person. So the term Jim Crow law, or the Jim Crow system, means laws that were specifically aimed at African Americans. All right, so that's the origin of the name. But where did the system come from? And for that, we're going to have to do a fairly deep dive into American history. And I won't be able to go into everything here, but let's kind of look at this from the 1,000-foot view and get a sense of the overall pattern of slavery, the Civil War, and race relations after the Civil War to see where Jim Crow starts. Now, I've been daring here and done a vertical timeline. The first thing we have on here is the end of the Civil War. Now, before the Civil War, in the southern part of the United States, which I have outlined in red here, most of these states had legal slavery. And in these states, or the colonies that preceded them, starting about 1620, they imported African slaves to be unfree laborers on cash crop plantations. And these might include tobacco or cotton. And that system of slavery persisted until the balance of power between the North, where slavery was largely illegal, and the South, where slavery was the backbone of the economic and political system. Eventually, it tore the country apart into the Civil War. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, saying that all enslaved people in the states which were currently in rebellion were now free. But it wasn't until the end of the Civil War that slavery's end was official everywhere in the United States. And the end of slavery really posed a problem for the states of the South. Now, obviously, this was a wonderful thing for people who had been enslaved. Now they had full freedom to move and work and marry whomever they pleased, at least in theory. But it also meant that the system of slavery, which had dominated the politics, the economics, the social system of the South for more than 200 years, was now over, and something had to replace it. So in the immediate period after the Civil War, the question is, what are race relations going to look like in the South? How will whites and blacks relate to each other without the system of slavery, which has dominated the entire region for more than 200 years. And we'll get into that in our next video.
All right, I don't know if I want to keep playing these or not. I don't know. She's. I think there's better things here. Let's see. Failure of Reconstruction. Right, let's do that one. I think this would be. Yeah, that's Creative Commons. Okay.
How do you define freedom? Stop for a minute and picture what it means to be free. What comes into your mind? Traveling wherever you please? Having enough money to do what you want? Or is freedom better defined by what it's not? Not having anyone telling you what to do? Not being in prison? Freedom is a core aspect of U.S. national identity. But if someone gave you a box labeled contents, freedom. What would you expect to find inside? This was the question that the United States faced during Reconstruction, the period following the Civil War when the U.S. government, Southern state governments, and African Americans attempted to negotiate a new social and political order for the South. But what African Americans expected to find in the box labeled freedom was very different from what their former enslavers wanted to put there. Was freedom just the absence of slavery, as most white Southerners believed? Or did it imply citizenship, political power, and economic self-sufficiency? Trying to solve this dilemma, Congress passed and the states ratified 3 new constitutional amendments during the Reconstruction era. The 13th Amendment, which ended the system of slavery in 1865, the 14th Amendment, which extended citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States in 1868, and the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote in 1870. So in just 5 years, African Americans in the South went from personal property to full civic participants, at least in theory. In reality, how different were definitions of freedom, citizenship, and democracy before and after Reconstruction? To really answer this question, we need to examine continuity and change in the Reconstruction era. What stayed the same and what changed in each of these 3 areas following the passage of the Reconstruction amendments? Okay, first, let's look at continuities and changes in the definition of freedom. Before the end of slavery, African Americans had neither economic nor physical freedom. They didn't have control of their bodies or of their labor. The pass system kept them from moving freely, and slavery itself meant that they couldn't choose where to work or earn money from their own work. So how much did their physical and economic freedom change after the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery? Well, their economic self-sufficiency went through some ups and downs. Most African Americans believed that their years of unpaid toil entitled them to land of their own. U.S. Army General William Tecumseh Sherman redistributed Confederate territory on the coasts of Georgia and South Carolina to Black families, who farmed there for a few years until Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, gave all confiscated land back to its former owners. Instead, most Black farmers became sharecroppers, renting a portion of a white landowner's farm in exchange for part of the crop yield. This gave Black farmers a lot more freedom over their own work, since they didn't have to work under an overseer. But economically, sharecropping kept Black farmers, as well as small white farmers, in an endless cycle of debt and poverty. After the 13th Amendment, most Southern state governments attempted to limit the physical freedom of African Americans as well, with statutes known as the Black Codes. Many of these codes defined anyone who wasn't under a labor contract as a vagrant, who could be arrested and have their labor sold. Later, segregation limited the physical freedom of where Southern African Americans could go and what they could do. Laws like the Black Codes, which so obviously attempted to institute slavery by another name, led Congress to pass the 14th Amendment, which defined a U.S. citizen as anyone born or naturalized in the United States, and specifically prevented states from infringing upon the rights of citizens. Before the Civil War, citizenship was exclusively the privilege of white Americans. Non-white immigrants weren't eligible to become U.S. citizens, and the 1857 Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott declared that no African Americans could be citizens at all. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, led to a huge increase in the number of U.S. citizens, and it decoupled citizenship from whiteness. Even the American-born children of Asian immigrants were citizens. But the Supreme Court defined the 14th Amendment very narrowly in the late 19th century, permitting many laws that discriminated on the basis of race. Only in the 20th century would the 14th Amendment become an important tool for civil rights activists to break down segregation. Lastly, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, extended the right to vote to Black men. In the years leading up to the Civil war, with few exceptions, only white men had the right to vote. The 15th Amendment radically redefined the terms of American democracy. During Reconstruction, more than 2,000 African Americans held public office, including 2 U.S. senators. But there were limits to this new, broader definition of democracy. First, it didn't include women, much to the frustration of the women's suffrage movement. Then, as the federal government ceased to intervene to protect Black citizens in the South in the late 1870s, Southern state governments imposed a range of voter suppression tactics to effectively bar African Americans from voting, which then reduced the likelihood of Black politicians winning office. Not until the 1960s would African American voter registration once again reach Reconstruction era levels. So how much did the Reconstruction Amendments change definitions of freedom, citizenship, and democracy? Well, after the amendments, African Americans were free to own their own bodies and labor, but that was about it. The 14th and 15th Amendments led to short-lived revolutions in the concept of citizenship and in voting rights, but those rights had all but evaporated by the end of the century. Nevertheless, although they didn't have much of an impact in the short term, these amendments would lay the foundation for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.
Okay. So, all right. So she got into a little bit more on that one. Yeah. So basically, they screwed up. They screwed up Reconstruction because Lincoln got shot, and the guy who took over was an idiot, and he screwed up Reconstruction. So they were able to do all these, basically make it almost as bad as it was before. And then, let's see, chronologically, we keep moving up. Jim Crow. Let's see what else we got here. Plessy. Yeah, okay, Sal talked about that. Brown, I don't think they talked about that yet. Wanted to, not talking about there's a lot of terrorism that went on, starting around the turn of the century. There's a lot of terrorism against Black people. Anyway, I guess we don't need to watch a video about that, but it got really bad, turn of the century and through like the first couple, 2-3 decades of the 20th century, all through that time, and into the 19th century and into the 20th century. It was really bad. And then there was the war. We had got involved in World War II, and after the war, then Black people fought in the war, and they came back and said, okay, now we're gonna really get our freedom, really get free, rights and all that. But that didn't happen right away, so they had to fight for that. Yeah, I don't see anything here that. All right, so let's just get to the civil rights movement. See if we get some here. So that's kind of background, right? Those couple videos were just kind of background, of what happened. Let's see. Okay, non-violent peace movements. Okay, that's interesting. I'm going through these videos here. They come up in the search here for stuff. Okay, Brown versus Board of Education. That was probably one of the earlier ones, I guess, in the civil rights movement. Well, here we go. Here's an introduction to the civil rights movement. Okay, let's do that one. Oh, wait, that's not the. Oh, I see what I did wrong here. Okay, I'm sorry. Excuse me just a second here while I fix my mistake here and make sure that we. It was giving me results from places other than the Khan Academy. And I don't know what the rights are on that stuff. Let's see. Origins of Jim Crow, failure. Okay, so here we go. Action. Okay, here we go. All right, so we'll watch this one. All right. This is the, so we're still on Khan Academy. This one is called Brown versus Board of Education. And this is when they were trying to get rid of segregation. You know, she talked about that a little bit. Anyway, they'll explain it here. There was a court case. I'm sure he'll explain it.
Hi, this is Kim from Khan Academy, and today we're learning more about Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Decided in 1954, Brown versus Board was a landmark case that opened the door for desegregation and the modern civil rights movement. In Brown, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools for white and black children, which had been prevalent throughout the American South since the 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson legalized segregation, were in fact inherently unequal. The named plaintiff in this case, Oliver Brown, was the father of Linda, a third grader who had to take a bus to a segregated elementary school that was much farther from her home than the nearby school for white children. To learn more about the Brown case, I sought out the help of two experts. Theodore Shaw is the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina School of Law. Michael McConnell is the Richard and Frances Mallory Professor and Director of the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. So, Professor Shaw, could you just kind of set the stage for us? What was the overall social and political context behind this case?
Well, Brown was decided in the Cold War era. I think that's important for reasons that I'll come back to. But it also was decided, I guess it was 58 years after the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal railway cars were constitutional. Of course, that extended to all walks of life in the South. And so what you had was Jim Crow segregation sustained and set in place by law. And Brown was the case that cracked the edifice of Jim Crow segregation. So it was an enormously important case. It came after a long campaign by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to overturn Plessy.
One thing that I think is really confusing about Plessy versus Ferguson is how it interacts with the 14th Amendment. So immediately after the Civil War, Congress passed and the states ratified the 14th Amendment, which gives equal protection under the law to all citizens. But then Plessy versus Ferguson, just a couple decades later, legalizes segregation. Can you talk a little bit more about how the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment has been interpreted in Plessy and then later in Brown versus Board?
The doctrine of separate but equal was itself a departure from the prior understanding of what the 14th Amendment meant. In the immediate wake of the 14th Amendment, segregation was understood to be a violation of equal rights. Thus, the Congress of the United States passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited mandatory segregation of among other things, railroads. Now, that was struck down in 1883, I believe it was, 1886, but for reasons not related to separate but equal or segregation. But it's only in the late 1880s and 1890s that states began passing Jim Crow legislation like the law in Plessy versus Ferguson. I think Plessy very likely would have come out a different way had it come up 25 years earlier. It's really very difficult to understand the logic of Plessy because Plessy takes the point of view that segregation is okay because it treats everyone the same way, and the sense of inferiority or insult that comes from segregation, the court just ignored. You can read the opinion different ways, and people do and have read the opinion different ways. A portion of the opinion makes it sound as though this is a kind of social science conclusion that segregation breeds a feeling of inferiority that has a deleterious effect on the Black students' performance in school.
There's a famous footnote in Brown versus Board of Education, footnote 11, in which some social scientists, and particularly a Dr. Kenneth Clark, did a series of tests, the doll tests, in which they showed black and white dolls who were otherwise identical to little children, little black children. And they asked who was the good doll, who was the bad doll, who was the pretty doll, who was the ugly doll. And the black children would invariably choose the white dolls as the better dolls and the black dolls as the inferior dolls. And then finally the bombshell question, which one looks like you? And they would stop and choose the black doll. And many times tears would come to their eyes. And so this whole notion of the inferiority that segregation imbued in black school children was important. And the Supreme Court had some very eloquent language about that.
Everyone knew that the only reason to have laws requiring black and white to be separate was because of the feeling on the part of the dominant white group that the African race was inferior. I think it was a failure of political will, really, rather than a matter of constitutional or legal logic that led to that. And then it took, almost 60 years before the Supreme Court would turn itself around.
The late A. Leon Higginbotham, who sat on the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in Philadelphia, he used to say that Plessy was wrong the day it was decided. And I believe he was right about that. If you go back and look at the rationale stated in Plessy, it's not, it doesn't hold up. It's not an intellectually honest decision. And having said that, if you look at Brown, it really did not overrule Plessy on its face with respect to segregation and Jim Crow across the board. What it did was say that in the field of public education, separate but equal is unconstitutional. Separate schools cannot be equal. And what followed Brown was a series of cases in all kinds of areas in which the court, sometimes without much of an opinion, cited Brown, but struck down segregation in public libraries and public accommodations and transportation, et cetera. The case that settled the long-running boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, that catapulted Martin Luther King into the national and world stage. It was decided, it was resolved finally. The boycott was important, but it was resolved by this case that the Supreme Court decided, and it cited Brown.
So Thurgood Marshall and the Legal Defense Fund had kind of been chipping away at the edges of segregation, and then they turned directly to school segregation in the Brown cases. So what kind of arguments did they use to challenge the system of school segregation?
Thurgood Marshall and his co-counsel in the NAACP established a very careful strategy of one case at a time, sort of pushing the envelope of this idea that segregation is inconsistent with the demands of equal protection. And the interesting thing about Brown itself, the case challenging segregation in Topeka, Kansas. Why Topeka, Kansas? Why was this such an excellent place to raise the challenge? And the reason is that the schools in Topeka were very substantially equal in quality. In Topeka, they actually had integrated high schools and middle schools. It was only the elementary schools that were segregated. And the district court found, and the Supreme Court did not disagree, that in terms of their material advantages, that the black school was essentially just as good as the white school. And that's why the NAACP wanted to go after Topeka, because then it went to the principle of the thing. It's one thing to attack a segregation when separate but equal is really just a fiction. But when separate but equal is a reality, at least pretty close to it, as in Topeka, you have to go after the actual principle that segregation is wrong in principle and not just wrong because it tends most of the time to lead to a material disadvantage.
Brown was actually 5 cases. The Brown case itself came from Topeka, Kansas. In many ways, the Supreme Court might have chosen to lead with the Brown case because it wasn't part of the South. And so in some ways, it might have been viewed as taking pressure off of the South. But there were 5 cases altogether. There was a case out of South Carolina, a case out of Virginia, a case out of Delaware, a case out of Washington, D.C., and then the Topeka case. And the Brown family was actually not even the only family named Brown in the Topeka case. And the other Brown case did not have their father available as the lead voice, and they wanted a man. And so Oliver Brown was the one they chose. They stipulated that the schools were, in fact, equal in all respects. And of course, they weren't. It was never possible to make separate but equal. But they stipulated that these schools were equal, the black and the white schools, because they wanted the court to be able to, or to have to, confront the issue of whether separate but equal per se was unconstitutional.
Interesting. So it's this place where they're hoping not to have a ruling that, for example, the schools for black children need to be brought up to code to be the same as white children, but they're trying to strike down the idea of segregation altogether. And indeed, they rule unanimously that separate but equal facilities are inherently unequal.
The Supreme Court in Brown says, well, whatever may have been the status of education as a civil right back in the 19th century, by now it surely is a civil right, and therefore there can be no discrimination with regard to it. Then one other thing that changed that I think the Supreme Court doesn't refer to, but many historians think was surely in the back of their minds, has to do with foreign policy, of all things, that during this time, the United States, in the wake of World War II, was playing a very major role in opposing colonialism, opposing communism, and trying to spread the gospel of liberty around the world. And when we had segregation at home, this looked like rank hypocrisy.
This was the Cold War period. These soldiers came home from fighting a form of racism in Europe, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust. And when they came back to segregated America. And there are many stories that are painful about what their experiences were. But meanwhile, the United States is having this Cold War with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was exploiting this inconsistency in what America said it was and what it was. And though the Supreme Court never said a word about that in the Brown cases, that was very much context for that decision.
So what did it take for desegregation to really come about? Do you think we've achieved desegregation?
Yes and no. There was a long battle to implement Brown. And in fact, for the most part, Brown was not implemented fully to the extent it ever was until the early 1970s when the Supreme Court decided a case called Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education in North Carolina and sanctioned the use of busing.
This does not depend upon what social scientists might think about how people do in school. This is a much more fundamental principle of equality under the law, that our law must treat black and white the same, that for the government to draw racial distinctions is fundamentally unequal and unconstitutional and wrong and unjust, fundamentally so, and not just as a matter of social science evidence.
I don't want to sound despairing, but I think if anybody looks at our public schools today and many of our communities and our towns and cities and our counties, we have to acknowledge, honestly, that there's still a great deal of segregation. And there are many schools that are identifiably white or identifiably black, and now, Latinos, Hispanics, large degree of segregation there also. And even voluntary desegregation efforts have been found by the Supreme Court a few years ago to be largely unconstitutional and illegal, and that's tragic. But that doesn't mean that Brown wasn't significant. I was born in the year of Brown versus Board of Education. The America that I grew up in is a very different country than the one that preceded it, in spite of our flaws and our warts. No Brown versus Board of Education, no civil rights movement, I would say, and ultimately no desegregation of our society to the extent that we've accomplished it, and we have to a great degree. No Barack Obama. So I think Brown stands, as I said, as a dividing point in America, but we can do better.
So we've learned that under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the decision in Brown versus Board of Education struck a major blow to the system of segregation. After World War II, amidst the ideological struggle of the Cold War, the Supreme Court overturned the precedent set in Plessy versus Ferguson and ruled that segregated education constituted a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. To learn more about Brown versus Board, visit the National Constitution Center's Interactive Constitution and Khan Academy's resources on U.S. government and politics.
Okay, that had a lot of stuff in it. That was pretty good. That had a lot of details in it. Most of the stuff you see talking about Brown, they show the standoff at the school, and that's without getting into a lot of the details and all that kind of stuff, and the National Guard and all that kind of stuff. This got into a lot more details about it, so that was pretty good. So that's the beginning. They said it there. That's really the beginning of the 20th century civil rights movement, in the 50s, 60s. So let's see what else we got here. I guess I need to do this. Let's see. Okay. Yep. So, let's see. 15th Amendment, social movements generally. Okay, we already did that. See if there's like an overview of the civil rights movement. That would be a good one to play right now, I think. I thought I saw one, but I never got one. No, that's not it. Continuity and change in the post-war era. Well, this looks interesting. This is kind of an overview of that period. But this might actually be interesting to watch here. It's broader than the civil rights movement. You know, this is going to talk about the war and everything else, but that's good to have that context when we're looking at this stuff. So let's play this one. Make sure we got Creative Commons. Okay, Creative Commons.
The era from 1945 to 1980 was action-packed, to say the least. During this period, the United States experienced the baby boom, the civil rights movement, the tumultuous 1960s, and the quagmire of Vietnam. This era was also riddled with contradictions. A sense of optimism in the future and a conviction that American economic prosperity was endless was tempered by fears of nuclear annihilation and a war on poverty. A foreign policy based on democracy and anti-communism abroad was undermined by the suppression of civil rights and civil liberties at home. Material comforts and Leave It to Beaver visions of suburbia clashed with growing calls for young people to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Would the generation that fought World War II even recognize the generation that protested Vietnam? That's the question I'd like to explore in this video, taking a high-level look at the impact the events of the post-war era had on reshaping American national identity. How much did American national identity change, and how much did it stay the same over this time period? To answer this question, first we have to define what we mean by American national identity. In other videos, we've looked at a few aspects of American identity as core ideological beliefs about things like who counts as an American, whether the United States is exceptional, or whether it's possible for anyone to succeed so long as they work hard enough. So if we're trying to track continuity and change in American identity over the period from 1945 to 1980, what might be a few beliefs we should trace over time? I encourage you to pause the video and see if you can come up with a couple based on your knowledge of the events in this time period. Some big events that jump out to me are the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, as well as the protests of the 1960s. So with that in mind, the core beliefs I'd like to look at are ideas about the United States' role in the world, who counts as an American citizen, and the country's cultural values. You might have come up with a totally different set of beliefs, which is great. Try out this same process I'm about to model using the beliefs that you've chosen. Now that we've got a few aspects of national identity we want to track, let's compare each of them at the beginning of this period to the end of this period. Remember, we're doing a super high-level overview here, so I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to explain events in detail. But if something comes up that you're unfamiliar with, just make a note and you can look it up when you've got time. All right, let's see what changed and what stayed the same over this period in beliefs about the United States' role in the world. In 1945, the United States emerged as a world superpower, having abandoned isolationism as a foreign policy. Instead, the United States became a leading member of the United Nations and the NATO Defensive Pact. The U.S. government was determined to contain the spread of communism and the influence of the Soviet Union through providing military and financial support to nations fighting communism, which would lead to American military engagements in Korea and Vietnam. The United States also had a lot of confidence in its economic role in the world, as the only country whose industrial might hadn't been compromised by World War II bombings. Immediately after the war, the United States was the world's leading exporter of steel, cars, consumer goods, and oil. How does that compare to beliefs about America's proper role in the world in 1980? Well, the United States was still a world superpower at the end of this era, and it was still pursuing anti-communism as a foreign policy. But in the 1970s, the Cold War entered a period of détente, a relaxation of tensions and increase in cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. You could see this as the U.S. government accepting peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. This approach will change when Ronald Reagan comes into office in 1981, but the period of détente lasted until the end of the 1970s. The Vietnam War shook American confidence in its interventionist foreign policy. After the war, there was more reluctance to commit U.S. troops abroad, in what's been called Vietnam Syndrome. Likewise, the Nixon Doctrine called for U.S. allies to take primary responsibility for their own defense. Lastly, U.S. economic world dominance was threatened in the late 1970s as well, as Japanese and German automobile makers began competing internationally, and the energy-dependent United States found that its energy needs were increasingly tied to the oil-exporting countries of the Middle East. So in terms of what changed and what stayed the same from the beginning to the end of the post-war era, I would say that although the United States remained a world superpower committed to supporting its allies and opposing the spread of communism, by the end of the 1970s, the country looked to establish some limits to its intervention in world affairs. Next, let's look at how beliefs about citizenship changed during this period. After the shared experience of GIs in World War II, European immigrants who had been looked upon as dangerous others in the 1920s and 1930s were accepted as U.S. citizens and categorized as simply white, not Polish or Irish or Russian. But African American soldiers who had served in segregated units during the war weren't afforded the same courtesy. Despite Truman's executive order desegregating the military in 1948, Black veterans encountered racial discrimination after the war, along with difficulty accessing the government subsidies for education and home loans that white GIs took advantage of. The immigration restrictions that set national origin quotas in the 1920s were still largely intact, although the Chinese Exclusion Act had been repealed during the war as China was a U.S. ally. Chinese Americans were then eligible to become U.S. citizens. However, the new quota for Chinese immigrants was just 105 individuals per year. What were the beliefs around citizenship at the end of the post-war era? A lot changed during this time period, thanks to the Civil Rights Movement, Supreme Court decisions like Brown versus Board of Education, and legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At the end of the 60s, African Americans were able to access more citizenship rights than they ever had before. And in 1965, Congress repealed the old national origin quotas and passed new immigration laws, allowing Asians to enter the country, as well as prioritizing family reunification and the entrance of skilled immigrants. But in the late 1960s and 1970s, there was a backlash against the civil rights policies set by the Supreme Court and the Johnson administration, with many conservatives arguing that the federal intervention to advance civil rights had gone too far, and with some left-leaning organizations arguing that it hadn't gone far enough to address issues like housing and job discrimination. Looking at the changes and continuities in beliefs about citizenship over this period, I'd say there was an enormous expansion over time in who was considered a citizen or eligible to become a citizen of the United States. But there was also a growing antagonism toward the federal government intervening on behalf of civil rights. Last, let's look at American cultural values at the beginning and end of the post-war era. In the years after the war, there was an emphasis on domesticity and family life, and women were expected to give up their wartime jobs and seek fulfillment through motherhood and consumption. The United States began a post-war economic boom that looked virtually unstoppable. In fact, the American standard of living doubled in the 25 years after World War II. There was also a lot of pressure for Americans to conform to a homogeneous mass culture, idealizing the white suburban nuclear family. Fear of communist infiltrators led to witch hunts like McCarthyism, but few people questioned the wisdom of the U.S. government or authority figures in general. Compare that to the end of this period, after the tumult of the 1960s had turned American culture on its head. In the 1960s and 1970s, the sexual revolution and women's rights movement challenged the idealized nuclear family, allowing for a more permissive sexual culture and the advancement of women in jobs and education. Starting as early as the 1950s, the Beat generation began to question the emptiness of the single-minded pursuit of wealth that was the American dream. In the 1960s, students began to protest the draft and the military-industrial complex more generally, wondering what the United States was even doing in Vietnam. They vowed not to trust anyone over 30. By the 1970s, public confidence in the U.S. government was also at an all-time low, after revelations about presidential misdeeds exposed by the Pentagon Papers and the Watergate scandal. To add insult to injury, the endless economic boom finally seemed to be at an end by the 1970s, with deindustrialization and stagflation increasing prices and unemployment. So it seems like American cultural values changed a great deal from 1945 to 1980, from a culture of suburban conformity to one of greater personal freedom, but also greater cynicism. But it is important to note that the people of the United States didn't fully reject the premise of the American dream. Despite the counterculture of the 1960s, by the 1970s, most people were still looking for a good job and hoping to buy a nice home. If we return to our question then, how much did the events of the post-war era reshape American identity? I think we can respond that they reshaped it quite a bit. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the protest movements of the 1960s led to a U.S. national identity that was considerably more inclusive and socially free, but also a good deal less confident about its government or its role in the world. To see how these forces played out in the next stage of U.S. history, we'll have to look to the 1980s.
All right, yeah, that was that was a real overview there. I'm going to bring that up again. That last page here. Just
the era from 1945 to 1980 was action. Great deal from 1945 to 1980.
So, hi Peekaboo. Yeah, Peekaboo Draws came in a chat here. We chatted a little bit there, a few things. This is a a broad overview. The time period here, this doesn't really communicate the intensity of the change that happened. You know, things began to change. Like after the war, of course, it was, things were, the world was different after the war. And this is like the post-war stuff that happened right here. But like Vietnam, from the 60s, right? When Kennedy came into office, that's when things really started to change drastically, and that was like the 60s, right? So for these first 15 years, there was some basically stuff related to the war that was going on, and in Brown versus Board of Education came at the end of that period, but that first 15 years. But the 60s and like beginning of 1960 and then really a lot towards the end of the 60s and early 70s, it was a revolution. There was a revolution in the U.S. and the change. That's how quick the change was. It was a revolution that happened. And some of the stuff she didn't put in here, the environmental movement started here too. We landed on the moon. There's things that happened here that were just, obviously is a broad overview, but that's when a change was packed. It was packed into that decade and a half or so from the early 60s to the mid 70s. That's when a lot of change happened. I mean, you go through all the stuff that we did, either the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. We set up the Environmental Protection Agency and started doing environmental laws at that time. Landed on the moon. Stopped a horrible war in Vietnam. We got rid of a president. Right, kicked Nixon out of office. There's just so much that happened during that time. And in the cultural things that were going on too, right? The women's lib movement. I talked about that yesterday in the stream a little bit. Just on and on and on. Just all kinds of stuff that was going on. And then, and the other stuff that she mentioned. And the cultural changes too. I mean, you've probably seen that, the styles that, kids grew their hair long. There was baby boomers. When all the people came back from the war, the men, they came back and they got married and had kids, and did a family, and that's caused the baby boom. I'm one of those. I'm one of the baby boomers, and that was something that happened, and there was just a whole bunch of young people, right, that were born in the 50s, right after the war, there, late 40s and through the 50s, and so by the time the 60s came, in the mid 60s, they were adults, young adults. So we had this huge bunch of people who were young and willing to do new things and stuff like that, and it just caused it caused a revolution. It just caused massive changes, in society. So she didn't really get into that. She didn't talk about the baby boom. She didn't talk about some of that other stuff. But this is kind of a general overview. And within that whole context of all that stuff that was going on, the civil rights movement really made advances. Starting with Brown, and then culminating in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So that's what was going on there. All right, let's see if I can find another video here. Basically, what I'm doing, for those of you who just joined, I'm going through. I want to talk about Martin Luther King, but I was trying to do a little bit of context here about what was, from the Civil War on up, just to kind of give a little context of what was going on. All right, so let's. Okay, this is only a two-minute video, but that's this one's on the Voting Rights Act of '65, but that would be just a real short little thing. Okay, here we go. Letter from Birmingham Jail. This will actually probably outline a lot of it. It's a specific thing, but it will. I'm hoping this will actually outline a lot of what was going on at that time. And I'm not sure how he's going to. I haven't seen any of these videos, so they're all Creative Commons, so I know I'm covered there. So
what we're going to read together in this video is what has become known as Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote from a jail cell in 1963 after he and several of his associates were arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, as they non-violently protested segregation there. And I'm going to read an excerpt of it. I encourage you to read it in its entirety. It is one of the most powerful documents, frankly, I have ever read. And Martin Luther King often gets a lot of credit as an amazing speaker. People say, hey, he could read the phone book and it would move people. But this also speaks to what an incredible writer he was. Not only is it moving, but it really gives the philosophical underpinnings of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And many people attribute the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by Congress, as being heavily influenced by Martin Luther King's letter. Now, what motivated Martin Luther King to write this letter was a statement made in a newspaper by 8 Alabama clergymen, which encouraged the protesters to wait, saying that, yes, we are sympathetic to the injustices, but they should be resolved in the courts and not through the type of protest, the type of tension that Martin Luther King and his fellow protesters were creating. And so here's just an excerpt of what Martin Luther King wrote. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, when you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. I've read this many times, but every time I read it, and this is just an excerpt, as you can tell, it's incredibly powerful, and I encourage you to read it in its entirety and think about why this was such a powerful document, especially for catalyzing things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
All right, so that was very brief, but background of what it was like right at that time. Something that I haven't seen here in any of these videos. He's talking about, what Martin Luther King was doing. He was doing nonviolent protests, and civil disobedience and stuff. And Sal Khan was just explaining there that was like a, that letter really was explaining that some people wanted to just wait and go through court cases and just take their time, and Martin Luther King was saying, no, we got to move. But Martin Luther King wanted to do it nonviolently, but there were groups that wanted to be more aggressive and wanted to use violence as this was going on too. So I think that was always in the background, of what was every decision that the people in power were doing. They were like, there was always this threat that it could get violent, but it was. I mean, there were sporadic, acts of violence and things like that. There were several riots and things like that, but it never got into like a full-on war or really massive violence or anything like that. It was the violence was not much more than the amount of background violence there was just from crime and stuff like that. And there were the two assassinations. There were several assassinations, but the two main ones were Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. But the other, some of the Black Panthers. You hear the word Black Panther? If I say Black Panther now, most young people are going to think, "Oh, the movie," But Black Panther was a group. Black Panthers were a group in the '60s that were advocating for a little bit more violence, or a little more aggressive. someone wanted to go back to segregation, and it was kind of complicated, you know. But I don't see anything in here about that, so that's kind of weird that they don't talk about the Black Panthers here at all. Let me do another search here and see if I can find something on that, because that kind of, Martin Luther King wasn't the one who wanted aggressive change. He wanted massive change, but he wasn't even the most aggressive. You know what I'm saying? He wasn't even the one that was there were some that were even more aggressive. Let's see here. I'm gonna look up Black Panther and see if that. Let me see if they. Two-way frequency tables. No. Okay. Okay, I see what it's. Yeah, there's nothing in here. There's some people who made comments on his videos that mentioned Black Panther, and they're talking about the movie. So yeah, that's kind of been wiped out. So I don't know if you've never heard of it. If you've never heard of that, that was part of the whole thing. Was the Black Panthers were, a more aggressive thing, and then some of them had ties to communism. They wanted to get rid of freedoms generally, and have like a dictatorship or more, restricted freedom and stuff. So it was a lot of weird stuff going on, and a lot of groups had ties to China, because China saw this going on, and they were during this time they were. The U.S. had the Cold War with Soviet Union, but also with China. There was no, until Nixon opened up China. China was like we had a kind of Cold War with China too, kind of, and they would, try to use any of the stuff that was going on in the U.S. and try to influence that, provocateurs, Let's see here, civil rights movement. Okay, so let me see what I can find. Okay, so we did that. Did Brown. Unfortunately, memorial to civil rights martyrs. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, let's see. I guess we can talk about the Voting Rights Act. There's a very short video, so we'll just play that just to get a little bit more.
The 1965 Voting Rights Act, it's really important to understand the reach of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So it had a number of provisions that were designed to get at racial discrimination in voting, but probably its most important provision was the preclearance regime that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 established. So states that had historically discriminated against African Americans had to preclear any changes to their voting laws with the federal government before those changes could go into effect. Now, the real life impact of this was momentous. African Americans had voter registration and turnout in some parts of the South at this time at like 0%. And it skyrocketed in the wake of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Had the court in 1966 determined that the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, all of that progress would never have happened, because it really was Congress's attempt to try to be creative to address almost a century of discrimination in voting. But by 1966, the court was on board. This is not the court of 1903 that decided Giles versus Harris. This is not the court that was dismantling the Reconstruction Acts passed in the wake of the Civil War. This was a court that was just as committed to protecting African-American voting rights and really minority voting rights more generally, because the Voting Rights Act wasn't just about African-Americans in the South, although it was the primary focus, but other groups had also been historically disenfranchised as well. And so the act just became very important for allowing the federal government to police and protect the voting rights of minorities in this country writ large. the courts on board in 1966. So South Carolina versus Katzenbach, they recognized that the Voting Rights Act was unprecedented in a sense of when you think about the world of federal legislation and you think about our system in which we typically think of states as having pretty broad authority to set voter qualifications, the Voting Rights Act was viewed as unprecedented because it interrupted that discretion. Right now, states that have terrible records on voting rights, they have to report to the federal government. That is not typical in our system, but the Supreme Court recognized that it was necessary, right? It wasn't that Congress had not tried case-by-case litigation challenging restrictive voting laws in the South, but that litigation through the Department of Justice had not been successful. So more stringent legislation was needed in order to address really what was a systematic problem. And so in South Carolina versus Katzenbach, the court found that there were certain federalism costs that were imposed by the Voting Rights Act, but it was necessary given the levels of discrimination that existed in the South at the time.
I want to look for the date when this was done, because there's been a court case or a couple court cases after this in which a lot of that was undone. Yeah, let me see if I can watch on YouTube here and see if I can get a date when that video was made. All right, I'm gonna make sure this is Twitch safe. Make sure there's anything weird here. Okay. Okay, well this is May 23rd, 24. But there, the Supreme Court kind of relaxed those requirements, you know. That they said all these states haven't messed up, you know. So we're gonna get rid of some of that oversight. And as soon as they did that, then the states started doing wacky stuff, you know, and doing bad stuff and making people wait in long lines and all that kind of stuff. So that was the Voting Rights Act. Let's see if we got the Civil Rights Act, if they got a video on that. Let's see. This is kind of interesting. This one here, he mentions Martin Luther King in this video. So, and it's about social movements, so it might be interesting to watch this one too.
Social movements are instrumental
to changing the path of a society. When a group of people comes together with a shared idea, they can create lasting effects by encouraging change in their society or by resisting it, both of which will shape the future of their society. But a social movement is not just a group of people with an idea. If that were the case, every little group with a novel idea would be starting a social movement. No, social movements need organization, leadership, and resources if they ever hope to gain momentum and make an impact. There are different types of social movements depending on their goal. Activist movements are focused on changing some aspect of society, while regressive or reactionary movements are actively trying to resist change. So you can generally see how a social movement will form. You get a group with a strong shared idea that has the resources and leadership to survive, and they can make a difference in one way or another. Specifically, though, it is not well defined. There are several theories as to how and why social movements form. One of these is called mass society theory. Early in the study of social movements, people were skeptical of the motivations of those involved in social movements. They were seen as dysfunctional, irrational, and dangerous, and that people would only join because the social movement provided a sense of community and refuge from the meaninglessness of life on one's own. This viewpoint was strong during the 20th century, the time of Nazism, fascism, and Stalinism, which were social movements that resulted in the destruction of millions of lives. But this theory did not persist through the century. By the 60s, scholars took a more open look at social movements, especially after the civil rights movement, which certainly did not arise simply to satisfy a psychological need for involvement. More recently, a few main theories have been developed. One is the relative deprivation theory, which focuses on the actions of groups who are oppressed or deprived of rights that other people in their society enjoy. So, if you look at the civil rights movement from this viewpoint, it is obviously a response to the inequality and oppression experienced by people of color in the US. But what is interesting about social movements is that it isn't always the people who are the worst off who join up. More important is how people perceive their situation. Someone just scraping by can be happy as a clam because they made their dream of owning their own little corner bistro into a reality. And then a person making $100,000 a year is frustrated because they don't feel like they are respected by their company. So what you have to look at is the relative deprivation, the feeling of a discrepancy between legitimate expectations and the reality of the present. But that's not enough on its own. People must feel like they deserve better, and they must think that they cannot be helped by conventional means. According to relative deprivation theory, those three things are necessary for a social movement to form: a relative deprivation, a feeling of deserving better, and a belief that conventional methods are useless to help. But there are criticisms to this theory. Even people who don't feel deprived will choose to join a social movement. They join because they want to address a perceived injustice that they may not even suffer from themselves. It can be too risky for the most oppressed people to join a social movement because they may not have the resources to participate. They cannot take time off work to promote the idea. Even so, there are exceptions, as always. Under Cesar Chavez, migrant farm workers united to gain rights and job security. Another issue with the relative deprivation theory is that sometimes, even when all three factors are present, no social movement is created. Okay, so it has some problems, but it's a start at least. Another theory, resource mobilization theory, looks at the social movements from a different angle. Instead of looking at the deprivation of the people, the resource mobilization approach focuses on the factors that help or hinder a social movement, practical constraints like access to resources. Even the seemingly simple act of gathering together a group of people with a shared idea is not allowed everywhere. It takes more than an idea to start a social movement. You need money, materials, political influence, access to media. More than that, a social movement needs a strong organizational base to recruit members, and then to unite them on a single idea. A good, charismatic figure is necessary to lead the group and focus the thoughts of members and the oppressed on the objective to convince them to organize. Again, looking at the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. stood as a beacon to the people of color who were oppressed. He knew how to speak to a crowd and unite them in a single idea, and how to gain the support he needed for the social movement to succeed. Then you have the rational choice theory, which proposes that people compare pros and cons of different courses of action, and choose the one that they think is best for themselves. The choices and actions of individuals who are trying to do the best for themselves shape the pattern of behavior in society. But there are a lot of assumptions for rational choice theory to work. You have to assume that all actions can be listed in order of preference, and that all preferences are transient. That means that, let's say, I like apples better than pears, and I like pears better than bananas. If that's transient, then that means I have to like apples better than bananas. It also assumes that a person has full knowledge of what will happen as a result of an action, and that a person has the cognitive ability to weigh different actions. These are a lot of assumptions, which are rarely all true. Social movements can even affect people not actively involved in them. Social movements can cause collective behavior like panics, where widespread unreasoning fear causes people to act hastily, and crazes, which are like fads, where something is incredibly popular for a short period of time, like the latest craze in music or dieting. This past year, the anti-vaccine movement has created a panic that has resulted in outbreaks of diseases that were once eradicated from the developed world. Now that we have a couple movements to toss around, it might be interesting to look at what happens to a social movement from beginning to either success or failure in the end. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. Wait a minute. Sorry, that's the wrong story. Social movements, right. Those begin with a few ideas shared by a few. Then you have the incipient stage, when the public begins to take notice of a situation that they consider to be a problem. At this point, people begin to organize, to coalesce into an organized group, and raise up a general stink. A social movement's greatest achievement will be to either succeed in changing its host society, or else it will have to adapt. What is interesting about social movements is that, in the end, they become a part of the bureaucracy they were trying to change. A successful social movement eventually gets absorbed into the existing institutions when it has achieved its desired changes. Our entire culture and society is formed from past social movements, both those that have succeeded and those that have failed. Even in failure, social movements leave a mark on their society. The social movement Martin Luther began against the Catholic Church resulted in Protestantism. His namesake, Martin Luther King Jr., fronted a social movement against segregation leading to the Civil Rights Movement. Even Nazism left its lasting mark on world politics. In their time, each of these social movements seemed radical, far-fetched, extreme. Now, we accept Protestantism as a founded religion, and we don't think twice about the right every person has to freedom and equality. I wonder what social movements of today will become accepted thought in the future. So, in the end, the social movement eventually declines. If it succeeded, it has been incorporated into the dominant culture. If it failed, it isn't active anymore, but you can still see the marks left on society by its passing. Social movements are instrumental to changing the path of a society. Now, we
Okay, so this this idea that social movements are absorbed into the dominant powers in society and all that. This whole video here was, basically just spewing out what the incumbents, what the people in power want people to think of what social movements are. So, no, successful movement replaces the dominant, gets rid of the dominant power structure and replaces it with something better. So, I don't know. It sounded like that was a young person. So, not to say anything. It's just experience counts. Now, international human rights. What does the Constitution say about voting? See, there's more here about war. I thought they'd have more in here about the civil rights movement. Well, we covered quite a bit there. But I don't see anything about the Civil Rights Act. So let me search for that specifically. We talked about it a little bit in one of those videos, but okay. Let's see. Voting Rights Act. All right, this one here, it mentions it.
Plessy v. Ferguson in the 1890s says that southern states, as long as things are equal between the races in terms of accommodations given, that segregation is all right. And so the Supreme Court, it narrows, it gives license to, essentially allows southern states to build these tight regimes of what I think we call today like authoritarian regimes, where large parts of their populations were disenfranchised. Jim Crow, we have a general decline in voting in the South. Among Blacks, obviously almost total suppression. This is more or less the status quo. The courts, the federal government are content to let this lie for the better part of 60 years. Of course, through all of this, Black Americans are organizing. They're pressing for their rights, for their freedoms in the South and the North, campaigns for bills to outlaw lynching. There's a massive campaign for a federal bill to outlaw lynching throughout the 1910s and 20s into the 1930s. But the thing that really begins to change the tide, and this kind of gets to one of my own views, which is that when thinking of what causes or what leads to constitutional change, you have to look from the bottom up primarily. You have to look at what's happening in the society. Beginning in the 1910s, you have this massive wave of migration of Black Americans from the South to the North, because although they didn't have political rights, if you could afford to, you could still move, you could still leave. The question was always, would there be jobs, right? Would there be jobs where you went? And with the advent of the Americans' entry into the First World War and our massive supplying of the Allied effort in Europe, and the draft that took 4 million American men and put them in uniform, there was this desperate need for labor in the cities of the North. And so that drew millions of African Americans. And it continued to draw millions of African Americans even after the war. And obviously, with the Second World War, this is even a greater wave of people moving to the North. And this does a couple things. First of all, it creates some pressure in the South to maybe make conditions like a little better. But importantly, it creates a whole new constituency of Black voters in the North, because there's no Jim Crow in the North. There's still a ton of discrimination, a lot of racism, a lot of violence, but there's no formal regime of vote suppression that could keep Black Americans away from the polls. And so all of a sudden, you have this big constituency of Black voters. You have politicians newly responsive to Black voters in the North, national politicians especially. And you have all the pressures that come with that, as well as the experience of the Second World War in particular, which is fought explicitly as a war for democracy, a war against fascism, a war against racism, against Nazi racial theories. And all of this begins to exert just tremendous pressure on the political system to really begin to resolve the question of the South and the status of Black Americans in the South. Pressures of the Cold War, great power competition with the Soviet Union, where at the time the Soviet Union is this seemingly, unstoppable, futuristic behemoth. And Americans are also have to show the world that the United States can also compete with that, not just economically or politically, but also ideologically. It's in all of this context that Black activists are making renewed pushes against segregation, renewed pushes against the legal architecture of Jim Crow, and that political elites are like newly receptive to it, because there are incentives in terms of votes, there's pressures in terms of ideological competition with the Soviet Union, and there's also sort of like an internal, we do have to make things better. We have to live up to our own ideals here. And so kind of a combination of all of that sets the stage for the Supreme Court to really begin essentially reevaluating the rulings it made in the late 19th century. Brown v. Board of Education, repudiating Plessy v. Ferguson, and then subsequent cases essentially repudiating the Supreme Court cases that held that Congress's power to protect people from discrimination, Congress's power to enforce civil rights was limited. Congress still had to act, but the Supreme Court was essentially giving it to the room to act, where it previously put shackles on Congress's ability to act. And so then we get Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act, the big one, of 1964. We get the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is the Fair Housing Act. Interestingly, the 64 Act is largely done under the Commerce Clause. I think it's interesting that the path the drafters take in terms of how they're going to justify this from the Constitution. But I think the big point is that the Supreme Court, as one set of powerful elites in the country, essentially it says, we're going to actually let Congress tackle this problem in a way that we didn't let Congress tackle it 60 years prior.
Nobody's turn the frickin' mic back on. Okay. What did I say? So yeah, I was looking for some other videos here, but they don't have that much on. Talking about Martin Luther King's life or something like that. I was looking for a good video on that. There are videos out there, but they're not released. They're not in public domain or not available. So, but yeah, Martin Luther King, he wanted to do it nonviolent. He wanted to be aggressive to change. He wanted rapid, change as quickly as possible, but he wanted to do it nonviolently and using, breaking. If there were laws that were unjust, they would break those laws just to protest them. But there are other people who were violent, or wanted to even be more aggressive and violent about it. And then it was a revolution, right? So that was the 60s, the revolution. Civil rights movement was part of a revolution that happened in the United States, but it was mostly nonviolent. There was some sporadic violence. There were some riots and things like that, but it wasn't like the Civil War or something like that, or the Revolutionary War that started the country. And then like the turn of the century, each revolution, there's less and less violence. It's more peaceful and it's more civil. So, but the Civil War was very violent, and in the progressive era at the beginning of this century, or the turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century, that had quite a bit of violence in it. That was like a labor type movement or something like that. And of course there was there was a lot of terrorism that went on and stuff like that. So there was a lot of conflict at the beginning of this century, beginning of the 20th century, and in the 60s, which was less violent even than the revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. So each revolution we have in the country is less and less violent. So this next one we're going to have should be, I don't think there'd be, people don't want violence. We don't want that anymore. Every time somebody talks about that, or even mentions it or something, everybody gets down on them, So this next revolution, I think, will be even less violent than the 60s. So each time, it's more peaceful. So be interesting to see how it unfolds, though. Just to see how this next revolution will unfold. There'll be a backlash, obviously, of what's going on. So, anyway, we've had quite a bit of. We've had more than enough reason to have the revolution. So it's kind of odd that it hasn't happened already. All right, so I guess that's it. Let me do something here. Bring this up. I have 3 of these up now. Oh, that's not right. Let me bring up my own channel here and see. I had everything shut down here when I was doing those videos, so. Okay. Oh, we got 3 viewers. So good. Okay, so that was. This wasn't too organized, but I wanted to just play some of those videos and stuff like that and answer questions if anybody had questions, and then kind of just add a little bit. I mean, I lived through a lot of this, right? I lived through the Civil Rights Act or the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s and stuff like that. So. I remember when Martin Luther King was assassinated. I mean, it was just so tense. It was just you could cut the tension with a knife, man. It was just so tense. Everything was tense. I remember riding in a car when it happened. People who were not racist were mourning about that. They didn't, and one of the things they did is everybody turned on the cars with their headlights and drove around, and that was like a showing respect or in mourning from the death of Martin Luther King. I remember we were driving in a car, and a woman was driving the car, and she had headlights on, and somebody who was obviously just stereotypical racist, type guy, pulls up and rolls down his window and says, "Hey, your lights are on," and he did it in a very threatening manner, And she said, "Oh, okay, thank you," and she just kind of avoided a confrontation. But that's the kind of stuff that was going on, at that time. It was just really tense. It could have gone so violent, There were riots, but it could have gone into. If we could have had another civil war, in the U.S., but people didn't want it. People didn't want that. People don't want violence, It's we slowly but surely we get a little bit better each time, and things improve, I hear people today talk about, saying, "Oh, things are so much better for black people now than it used to be, in the 50s or whatever." But like, what if in the 50s, were there people saying, "Oh, it's so much better now in the 50s than it was when there was slavery"? It's like, well, better doesn't mean right, that better doesn't mean it's where we should be, So, yeah, and it's just taking so long to make these changes, The Civil War was a long time ago, It should be done. Should have been done during Reconstruction, right? It should have been. That should have been it. That should have been that war should have decided the whole issue, And black people should be equal with white people. You should recognize everybody, everybody, no matter what their situation is, should be treated equally, It's just so bizarre. And then and politicians exploit that, They will, if they see a division among the people, they exacerbate that. They want division among people, because when the people are fighting among themselves, they don't look at the leaders and the billionaires and the people who try to wield power and see them as the opposition. It's just so bizarre. So the United States is really declined precipitously recently. We're no longer listed as a democracy. I don't know if you guys know that. We're no longer a democracy. You look at these indices, that list countries and say, "Oh, these are the best democracies," and rate them all, and then dictatorships all the way down to the bottom. They list this as a flawed democracy, so we're not a democracy anymore, So that sucks. We're not on the top on almost any measure, economics, just whatever. We used to be all the way at the top on all of those things. After World War II, we were way up there, and it's just gone down and down and down. And recently, it's gone down very rapidly. So I think we're going to have a. We have to have a revolution, to fix that. So, and it will be even more peaceful than the one in the 60s. There's scattered violence in the 60s, but I don't think there will be. This will be a peaceful revolution, and we'll, remove this regime and replace it with a democracy that actually cares about the people. So that's it. I guess I don't know unless anybody has any questions about that. I don't think there are any questions. Yeah, this wasn't a very structured thing. I just wanted, it's Martin Luther King Day, so I wanted to I went out on you know, on the interweb there and was looking at people's streams and stuff like that. Hey Shane, how are you? Yeah, you're at the end of the thing. You can watch the VOD. It's basically what I did is I just went through. You know, I want to talk about the civil rights movement. You know, Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King Day, and I basically just started at Reconstruction. You know how that got messed up, and what I did is I played a bunch of Khan Academy videos on that. You know, and then commented on them and filled in the gaps and stuff on the videos and things like that. Most of those videos were overview type stuff. We read portions of the letter from Birmingham Jail. You know, the basics. But tried to give a little bit more context to the background before getting into the civil rights parts of it. Seems like a fitting tribute. Yeah, it was pretty cool. It was pretty cool. I was going to ask you if you have any questions, but I think I would ask you questions about it. I'm the one who should be asking you questions about it. Yeah, you're I'm sure much more of an expert on that. My thing that I try to do. I don't do as much direct just talking history stuff like I did today so much, but like what I like to do is approach it from like we did that other video where I do reviews of movies and then try to figure out what the context was when those movies were made. I'd say it looks like you hit all the bases. Yeah, I touched on all of them. I think you know, I mean, it's hard to do it in a short little stream like this, but yeah, what I normally like to do in terms of like civil rights and that sort of thing is when I do a movie review, I'll look at the historical context of the movie, and then I'll talk about inclusion and representation within the movie itself. So like, you know, were there black people in the movie, or women, or you know, people with disabilities or whatever, and then how were they represented in the movie? You know, it's just something that I've done for years and years. Not streaming, but just on my own. You know, looking at film. I've always had an interest in film. I had some involvement with that. I used to live in Southern California, where a lot of movies are made and stuff. So, and that's, you know, there are a lot. It used to be like in the silent era and the early talkies and stuff like that. It was much more blatant, the discrimination in movies, you know. Very stereotypical representation, and you know, black people were always shown, you know, subservient to white people and all that kind of thing. It was very, very blatant. Now it's much more subtle. It's much more unconscious. You know, in the movies, when they try to do something, you know, I don't know. I've had all kinds of examples of that, and if you watch some of my reviews, you'll see that. And I'll show, like, if they show a group of people, if there are any black people in the scene at all, they will be actually literally marginalized to the sides of the frame of the image, you know, that they're showing, or their you know, the marginalized black people, put them at the very beginning of the movie or at the very end of the movie. You know, and they have, you know, usually it's stereotypical occupations, you know, and some of it's more subtle than others. Sometimes they will if they show a black person on the screen, you know, right before they show the person or right after they show the person, they'll have some negative dialogue or say something negative to you know, to have like an unconscious association in the mind of the viewer with the black person. So those are the type of subtle things that they do now to you know, try to be racist in the movies and stuff like that. Anyway, that's not what I was talking about here today, but it's kind of related. But that's how I approach it usually. I do that through movie reviews and stuff like that. So Anyway, yeah, we're wrapping it up here. So, I don't have enough people here to really rate anybody. I don't think so. What else is going on? Oh, yeah. If you're, you want to remind everybody, we're in the middle of a pandemic. People don't talk about that. I just want to remind everybody that it's going up right now. Cases are going up. We have 100 people a day are dying from COVID. You know, it's amazing that they're not talking about that. 100 people a day, every day. Well, Shane says, I hope I can catch another stream in the future. Seems like stuff that's in my wheelhouse. Oh, yeah. I think you would enjoy this stream. I'm not as polished as you are in my presentations. I'm not as prepared all the time. But, Peekaboo says, I was lurking and listening double. My internet went down for a minute, but I'm back. Oh, okay. Good. Yeah, I'm glad you were watching, Peekaboo. Yeah, this wasn't too structured, but anyway. Yeah, I wanted to mention that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and you need to wear these. Sorry about that. That's just going to make some noise here. But you need to wear these things that are. They're called N95 masks. I'm sure everybody's heard of that by now. I hope you have heard of that. Whenever you're in public, because 100 people a day are dying from COVID, and it's going up right now because of Christmas. We had the Christmas break. Everybody went home to their families and traveled and spread the germs around, and then they came back and spread it in their own communities, and we had a peak, an increase now. So a lot of people are dying. And so whenever you're in public, you need to wear an N95 mask, and it says, it has to say N95 on it. It has to have these straps that go all the way around the back of your heads. The ones that go around your ears are no good. Those may not protect you as well, and those are not N95 masks. If it has a loop that goes around your ear, it's not an N95 mask. You have to wear an N95 mask. It has to say N95 on it. And you have to make sure that it makes a complete seal around your face so that no air comes in around the sides. So I hope everybody takes care and make sure you wear a mask so you don't kill anybody, so you don't kill yourself, All right, no worries about comparison. Each of us living. Let's see. Yeah, Shane says, no worries about comparison. I teach for a living. Oh, yeah. It's second nature for me. Yeah, I can slip into structured narrative mode without even knowing. Yeah, it's a skill. Yeah, I guess you do. I've only been streaming for a few weeks here, so it's not, I've had some public speaking experience before, but this isn't like a big serious thing to me. It's not a job or anything like that. I just do it for fun. So I don't put a whole ton of effort into planning and all that stuff and preparing. I just kind of get an idea of what I want to talk about and go for it, So anyway, make sure you wear your mask. And even though nobody's talking about it, it's still a big deal. People are still dying, so got to wear that mask. All right. I don't think I have enough people to rate anybody. So, all right, everybody, take care out there. And I'm not sure when I'll do another stream. I've been trying to stream on YouTube more than Twitch, but YouTube just messed me up here. My last stream, I was in the middle of a stream and they cut it off. They cut me off and said I was streaming copyrighted stuff, and I was streaming a movie made in 1929, which is obviously in the public domain. So it was real weird. So I'm having a debate going on with YouTube right now. So maybe I'm going to do some more streams on Twitch for a while until I get that resolved. Anyway, I'm not sure when. I don't go by the schedule, so just watch your notice, however you get your notices or whatever when I come on. So everybody take care. We'll talk with everybody later. Bye-bye.